Okay. Um, Today I'd like to mention a few teachings of my father, Rabbi Dr. Wilfed Zeev Shuchat. Um, it was the second yahrzeit yesterday, and therefore I'd like to do that in his memory. L'ilui nishmato, Aliyat neshama shel Rav Zeev ben Meir. Um, as individuals, it's important for us to find teachers who can inspire us. On my talks in Pirkei Avot, I brought the interpretation of the Maharal of Prague, who says on Aseh lecha rav uknei lecha chaver, make for yourself a rabbi and acquire for yourself a friend. He says, what does it mean, make for yourself a rabbi? And he says, if you find somebody, I'm paraphrasing, Maharal says, if you find somebody who teaches you how to be a good human being and a good Jew, and who inspires you to be like this, make that person your rabbi, even if they don't have a rabbinic degree. But the point is, we all need people who inspire us because that's how we grow. Some of us can do it from within, but many of us, especially at the beginning, we need people like that. I thankfully had people like that as I was growing up who were able to inspire me. I was just teaching this week in a class in Bar Ilan about Yosef Chaim Brenner, the early Zionist who came to Israel at a young age, was involved in the Yishuv, and mostly was involved in actually Hebrew literature. But in his biography, I saw that he came from a very religious background. He went to a Chabad yeshiva to study after Cheder, and he was friendly with the rabbi's son. And because both of them were interested in Hebrew literature, they were kicked out of the yeshiva. And then, of course, he left uh, observant Jewish life completely, went to the yeshuv. And in the yeshuv, among those who made aliyah, what was called the second aliyah, was Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook. And Brenner met Rav Cook and was actually quite taken by Rav Cook. He was surprised that you had a rabbi who was so sympathetic to the settlers and to the what we call the chalutzim, those early pioneers, despite the fact that they were so far removed from Judaism. And it's a pity he didn't meet him earlier on in his youth. Maybe things would have been a little bit different, but never know how history plays out. When Rabbi Cook came to Merchavia on his famous trip to the Yishuvim in the north, to the settlements and the kibbutzim of the second Aliyah. So when they came to Merchavia, he, together with Rabbi Charlap and other rabbis from the old Yishuv, so like Rabbi Sonnenfeld, and so one of the people from Merchavia who also had come from that type of background and was rebellious, walked over to him and says, rabbis, you're wasting your time here. You're not going to have any influence on people like us. And without the blink of an eye, Rabbi Cook looked at him and said, we didn't come here to influence you. We came here because we wanted you to inspire us from what you're doing here. And it's rabbis like that who sometimes, who are able to think out of the box and connect to people, are the ones who inspire us. And there are also other types. So in my own upbringing, I was quite lucky to have rabbis who inspired me both in Israel and in Montreal, and people, not just rabbis. I mean, in Montreal, of course, probably the greatest inspiration of my life was my father. Maybe the other ones another time I will talk about, but there were other people who inspired me in different ways in my life. But my father, both by his teachings and even more so, I would say, by his life commitment to Yiddishkeit, to the world, to the Jewish people, to the rabbinate, to study, and to the highest ethical level that he really did believe in. And I don't want to eulogize, I just want to talk about some of his teachings. Let me start by saying, reading something from a booklet I put together towards the first yahzeit, and this is actually taken from his commentary on the Midrash Rabbi. There are 4 volumes of his commentary on Breshit Rabbah. By the way, if somebody wants a copy of those commentaries, they can be in touch with me, and I have extra books. In his book, The Garden of Eden and the Struggle to be Human, according to Midrash Rabbah, my father, Rabbi Wilfed, we pronounced it in English Shuchat, in Hebrew we say Shuchat, writes, the creation story begins with the word Bereshit, which is normally translated as in the beginning. This remarkable word and its exegetical possibilities take up a good portion of the early chapters of the Midrash. The last word of the creation story, however, is replete with meaning. The last word of that story is Asher bara Elohim la'asot, which means that God created in order to do. What is there about this that's so remarkable? For one thing, if that last word had not been including, everything about the paragraph would have been perfectly in order, because on that Sabbath day, God rested from all the work he had done. But that's not the way the text reads in the scripture. An extra word was added, and that changes the entire meaning. Roughly translated, it should be read, which God created in order to do, or in order to have done. What does all this mean? It means that God created an incomplete world, an unfinished symphony. It is not an accident. God deliberately created a world that somebody else would have to complete. Who was that somebody else? It was man, the human being, the greatest of all the creation. It was the human being created in the image of God who was to be elevated to become God's partner in creation. The creation story ends, therefore, with a mandate for man. Not only is the human being elevated to the highest position in creation, he's also given a cause for which to live, something to do with his life to make it not only meaningful, but to make God's purpose in creating his world effective. God left this world incomplete so that man could complete it. Let's get on with the job. The creation and recreation of the world is now in our hands. So that's something he wrote on volume 1, which was on Breshit. God creates the world incomplete. This is an idea, by the way, which is developed highly in the writings of Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Kabbalist from Padua in the 18th century. But already in the Midrash understands this, and it might even be the simple meaning of the text. The world is incomplete for mankind to complete it. In another place, in the book on Abraham, the 4th book, and the final book that came out, the Midrash, when it's talking about the 3 men who are sometimes called men, and later on when they meet Lot, called angels, the Midrash says, why sometimes are they called angels, and sometimes when they called men? When they come to see Abraham, it says 3 men came to see him. When they went after the 2 to go to save Lot, it says the angels. So here you call them angels, the Midrash says, and earlier they were termed men. Earlier, when the Shekhinah was above them, they were men, because God was above them. But as soon as the divine presence departed from them, they assumed the form of angels. That's the first opinion. Rabbi Tanchuma said, in the name of Rabbi Levi, to Abraham, who had a great spiritual strength, they looked like men. But to Lot, who was on a lesser spiritual level, they looked like angels. Rabbi Hanina said, before they performed their mission, they were called men. After they had performed their mission, they assumed the style of angels. Rabbi Tanchuma said, they may be likened to a man who has received a governorship from the king. Before he reaches the seat of authority, he goes like an ordinary citizen. Once he has performed the mission, he's called a man. So they too, once they perform the mission, before they perform the mission, they're called men. After performing the mission, they're called angels. And my father writes about this Midrash. Whoever reads the story of the special visitors to Abraham after his circumcision wonders that at the beginning of the story they're described as men, and at the end of the story they're described as angels. Everyone, young and old, who is exposed to this story reacts the same way. Why are they men in one place and angels in another place? The Midrash has various interpretations. One interpretation is that in relationship to Abraham, who had a special relationship to God, the angels appeared as men. In the case of Lot, whose moral position in life was low, they were immediately recognized by him as angels. A second interpretation might be that if they did not perform their mission, they were men and could be interpreted so. The moment, however, a mission is fulfilled, their category would change immediately and they would now be angels. So, what does that mean? I think it's a continuation of what he said in the first one. God gives us this world as men to complete. But once we complete the world in the way which is supposed to be done, we are also godly because we were created in the image of God. So we become like angels once we are able to fulfill the task that God wants us to fulfill because we're doing a godly task. So God created an incomplete world. Asher bara Elohim la'asot. He gave human beings the possibility to complete it. If we don't, we're human beings. To err is human. If we do, then we are basically bringing to expression the image of God within us, the godly aspect of us, and we are like angels. We become partners with God in fulfilling this universe. That's like the men who become the angels in meeting Abraham. I'd like to read another thing from a sermon that my father gave in 1996 on Remembrance Day, right? The day for the soldiers who fought in World War I and in World War II. And this was taken from that sermon. The story is told, he says, of a chaplain who visited a military hospital. He commiserated with one of the wounded soldiers who had lost a leg. But the soldier said to him, "I didn't lose my leg, sir. I gave it." I remember, my father writes, how impressed I was when I first heard this story. In my experience, the number of people who would answer in this way would be very small. But then I began to think of the realities of war and peace in Canada. Of course, he lived in Montreal. We're one of the few countries in the world where enlistment is voluntary. Even when conscription was introduced for a short time during the Second World War, it was for service in Canada only. The vast majority, therefore, of the generation that served could have said in all truthfulness that they gave their lives when they went, in the case of those who made the supreme sacrifice, or were ready to give their lives in the case of those who were spared because they volunteered. It seems to me that we owe something more to those who not only lost their lives, but gave their lives. What we owe can only be expressed with our giving in order for it to be commensurate with the sacrifice. We cannot change the world, but we can change ourselves. We who come to such commemorative ceremonies should be ready to give of ourselves. We should use such occasions to cultivate altruism, generosity, tolerance, and brotherlyhood. We should promote the idea that the only alternative to hostility is love. The only alternative to violence is peace. The only alternative to disagreement is mutual respect. If we did these things, we would not only have a country worth of dying for, but also a country worth of living for. And I think that this also is very appropriate for the state of Israel. We have conscription here, but we all know if a person wants, you don't have to be a combat soldier. You can use a little bit of pull here and there to get into some other thing within the army. As long as you go, nobody's going to make a big deal out of it. So there's so many, these people who are willing to put their lives on the line, these young people and older in Israel, because we have Miluim, they're willing to put their lives on the line for the state. We're willing to give of themselves. What should inspire us also, even us like myself who've been to the Israeli army, but it should always inspire us to be giving people, to be a little bit better than we thought we could be, because we can be a little bit better. And if people want to be giving and they want to be altruistic, then that's what creates a society, because love is about giving. And when you give love, then you have the possibility of receiving as well. And these are important things for us to think about and not just to be sad about those who made the ultimate sacrifice, but what we can do to appreciate such things. And I just want to end, I don't want to make this too long. I want to end by, my father used to always say that in life we need three things. We need something to do, someone to love, and something to live for. Every human being needs something to do, a job, a passion. Sometimes, in the rare case, their job is their passion. Someone to love, somebody in your life, a spouse, children, and something to live for. To feel meaning in your life, to feel direction. And these are things that we strive for. And maybe I'll end, instead of just, even though that was a good note to end on, I'll tell another little story, because in my booklet I put together things 2 years ago as I was on the way to the funeral. Things that I put down, things that I was thinking of at the time. So there are many things, and I don't think I want to say everything, but maybe I'll tell just a story, or maybe I should do this at another time. Okay, this is an unusual story, which my father wrote in a book of the history of the synagogue. Just an interesting story about himself. It says, in 1999, I was invited to take part in the dedication ceremony of the newly established Intercontinental Hotel on Vigor Street in downtown Montreal. After the ceremony, there was a reception. Somehow or other, I found myself in a small group which included the Archbishop of Montreal and Her Excellency Madame Jean Sauvé, who was the recently retired Governor General of Canada. For those who are not familiar, the Canadian government parallels the British Parliament, except that instead of a queen, the representative of the queen is called the Governor General. I cannot remember how the conversation started, but Madame Sauvé stated that when she died, a rabbi would be present at her funeral. We all laughed, including myself, because everybody knew that she was a good Catholic and a regular attendant at Mass. Well, it so happened that Madame Sauvé passed away in 1993. On the Friday afternoon of that week, I received a phone call from a member of the Funeral Arrangements Committee, informing me that her funeral would be on Saturday at the Mary Queen of World Cathedral and that I should be present. Now, Madame Sauvé had left written instructions with specific requests. At this point, I felt I had to accept. I hoped I was doing something good for the Jews and good for Canada. I did not know that that day would be the coldest day I ever remembered. And it was a Saturday morning. So basically, he had to leave shul early and walk. I finally arrived by foot. And just when they were about to begin, I was given the paragraph that I was supposed to read. And all the time I was thinking about Madame Sauvé, that she wasn't joking. A rabbi was present at her funeral. There are so many stories about my father because, we have a concept in the Talmud which is called Shimush Talmidei Chachamim, which means helping scholars. And the reason why you help scholars is because you learn from their lives. That's called Shimush Talmidei Chachamim. The idea of spending time with scholars is to learn from the way they live life, and not only by their teachings. And so, as I said, I had the merit to grow up with a scholar, and this had a big influence on myself. And there are others too, but maybe this is not the time to talk about the others. In the meantime, I wish everyone shalom, shalom.